Welcome to this last seminar in maritime seminar series, which is done in collaboration between Centrum for Maritime Studies and Swedish Maritime Museum. This is actually for the first time we have this seminar in this room, as many of you know. So this is quite newly prepared or planned, and it's a lot of new technology, but hopefully everything will work quite well. We have today here a guest from National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, Simon Stephens, who has been working for decades as a curator for quite a long time.
Yes. Yeah.
Quite a long time as a curator of ship models and the museum, and is one of the experts on that issue. Published a book on that a couple of years ago, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. We are quite many, so I think we will skip the usual presentation. We usually when we have a smaller group of people, so we go around. But this means that when Simon finished his presentation, and we will have time for questions, so please introduce yourself, say your name and affiliation, so Simon knows in which role you are asking, or you are taking part in the debate. This is what I would like to say. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me, and I'm really honoured to be here. As said before, I've been fortunate enough to work with ship models all my career at the museum. I started straight away from college as a trainee curator with the ship model collection, and I've been there for 38 years with the collection right the way through. So I'm a bit of a model nut, I'm afraid. So I apologise if I keep going on about models, but it's my passion, and I love them to bits. So, and I try and visit as many collections as I can. What I will say today is a brief overview of the collection that we have at Greenwich, which is obviously an international collection. I will also touch upon some of the research that we're doing with ship models in terms of how we're finding out how they're made and when they were made and who made them. And then at the end I put a small presentation on the end about our new model store, which is we had to move our reserve collection of models that were in storage to a brand new store in a Royal Dockyard to the east of London, which, you know, if you're ever over in London or Greenwich, I highly recommend you come and visit the store, and I will gladly take you around and show you the collection. So anyway, the ship model collection at Greenwich, like as it was explained to me this morning, has a similar history to it. Some of the models started life as official Navy models, some of which were used for discussion about new designs and proposals. Others were commissioned by wealthy individuals who were associated with the Navy, either in a serving capacity or as a private capacity, who were involved with the funding and launching side of ships. And that collection grew within the naval administration. It was in private hands, there was no public access to it at all. And it moved from the dockyards to what was then the naval administration in London at Somerset House, which you can now visit if you come to London. It's now a museum on the banks of the Thames. And by the early 19th century, the collection had amassed into such a scale that it was then opened as a museum in a sort of semi-private capacity. You could be taken around by members of the Navy Board or naval officers to see the ship models on display. It didn't really open its doors publicly until after what was the Great Exhibition of 1851, which was a big international exhibition in London. And on the proceeds of that exhibition, funds were used to build a new museum in South Kensington, which is now what is now the Science Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum on that site. That's where the Great Exhibition was held. And the naval collections were then moved into that museum, known as the South Kensington Museum. Later on in 1874, again, the collections outgrew the buildings, and the naval collections were then removed from South Kensington and moved to Greenwich, to what was the Royal Naval College, which is across the road from the National Maritime Museum as it is today. And that was a big training facility for naval officers in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Like you, our museum didn't really exist until 1934-35, and we opened our doors in 1937. One of our largest benefactors was a big shipping magnate, Sir James Caird, a Scottish shipping magnate who made his money through bringing beef from South America into the UK and refrigeration. And over the years he was a very avid maritime collector. He was keen that the UK had a national maritime museum, and he went round buying up English, Dutch art, ship models, paintings, textiles, all sorts of maritime artefacts, assembling this with the idea of forming the National Maritime Museum, and we opened our doors in 1937. We are now known as Royal Museums Greenwich, which includes the Cutty Sark on the right-hand side, which is the famous tea clipper, which is on display in the dock, the Queen's House, which is a royal palace, Charles I's royal palace, the old Royal Observatory, which is on the hill, which is where the time ball is and the Harrison chronometers are, and then you've got the National Maritime Museum here, which is in the old Greenwich Hospital School, which was used for training in the 19th century. So, a few facts and figures about the collection. As I said before, it's thought to be the largest in the world. It numbers over 3,500 ship models alone. Dating our earliest ship model is this model of an Egyptian funerary barge, which was recovered from a tomb in Thebes and dates from about 1800 BC. It's about so big, extremely fragile, and it has been tested to find out the species of wood, which is a fig wood that was used. Obviously there's been a large amount of paint degradation over the years. So that's our oldest model in the collection. One of our largest is, and this is now slightly out of date, this is the late 1990s, was of the big P&O cruise ship, the Grand Princess. The ship was over 100,000 tonnes in weight, and this model is about 6-7 metres long, and as you can see it's a bit of a lump to transport. And this was commissioned specially by P&O, one of our sponsors for the museum, for an exhibition we did about passengers and passenger ships and living at sea. We also have, supposedly, the largest ship model in a bottle in the world. This was part of a sculpture that was commissioned for the Trafalgar Square plinths. In Trafalgar Square there's a plinth where every year, or I think it's every 2 to 3 years, artists are invited internationally to submit a sculpture to be placed on the plinth outside the National Gallery. And this was an artist called Yinka Schönebert, who's from African origins and had an interest in the batik material culture, and obviously being Trafalgar Square, Nelson's Column and the Battle of Trafalgar and Victory, he mixed the two interests with a scale model of HMS Victory inside this giant glass, well, it's not glass, it's a plastic bottle. It's like a sort of demijohn, we would call it, for winemaking. And the cork comes out and we can crawl inside and we can clean and repair the model every year, which is, I've got some really good images of the conservator doing it, but I couldn't load them onto my PowerPoint today. But believe me, it's fun, and it causes quite a stir when the public are coming in. This is near our new main entrance in the museum, the Sammy Offa wing, on its plinth. As you can see, it's air conditioned. It's fully conditioned against all weathers as well, although it does sweat a bit in the summer, there's a bit of condensation. And we've got the normal sized ship models in bottles as well in the collection. So that's quite an interesting one. This is a lovely image here. As I said to you earlier, this is one of the earliest images that we have of the museum's collection in a public display in the South Kensington Museum, where you were actually taken around one of my forebears, a curator giving you a guided tour. And a number of these models here in this gallery we still have in the collection today, which is quite nice. This is one of our largest models of a 3-decker of HMS Queen of 1839. We have a number of these half models hanging around in galleries as well as these sectional models, which we'll come to later on. And even then we were hanging models on this rather ingenious contraption here from the ceiling. As I said, when we opened in 37, we were opened by the King then and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and this is our current Queen here as a child, Queen Elizabeth II. And they're all standing around a ship model. So they have royal patronage, the collection as it were, and this is a 19th century model of a 17th century ship, the Sovereign of the Seas, one of our first big 3-decker warships. And we still have this in the collection. So it's nice to see that the models play such an important part in the collection. So what I'll do is I'll just go through the collection in a sort of contemporary historical way. I'm just trying to find the buttons. This is our earliest, what we call scale model, built at a 1/4 inch to foot scale. So every 1/4 inch on the model equals a foot in full size, an English foot. It's an unnamed ship, 2-decker, 50 to 54 guns, and we think dates from about 1650 to 1655. At this stage, there are very little drawings that survived. The actual science of naval architecture was in its infancy in the UK. They were still developing formulas of how to build and design ships. So of course the scale model was a very important tool for this part of the story. And probably the most important part of the models at this period was the layout of the guns, the decoration of the ship, which was a massive political statement saying, you know, if you mess with us, you're in trouble, in theory. And then at the stern, you've got the accommodation of the officers, which at the end of the day, you had to please and make the right decisions to accommodate the officers on the ships. Apart from that, you know, the model was just left in frame, open frame, in its stylised framing. It's not how the ship was actually framed, it's a style of framing. And the theory I've come up with over the years is that when you look along the hull of a model like this, you get the very dark shadow and the light of the wood, and you're able to see the shape of the hull better. If the hull was planked, you wouldn't see the interesting curves that are going on here in the bow and in the stern. And this is what we call our Navy Board style, because these models were discussed at the Navy Board, which was the executive that ran the decision making for the British Navy. Sorry, I'm pushing all sorts of buttons here. Here we go. So that's our earliest scale, true scale model. This is we think, the oldest identified ship model in the world. This is a model of a 90-gun ship called the St Michael. And you can see here, this is slightly later, and they started to plank up the main whales. A lot of models at this time were made from English fruitwoods, which were very slow growing, very hard, and had very little grain. So the idea was that, you know, if you use something like pine, where you've got a very obvious grain, it diminishes the idea of scale on a model. So we were using apple, pear, and then later on we would use box as well for the carvings, which was a very good wood for carving, and lime. We're very fortunate with this model in that by careful measurements of the gun deck at certain points, we know the specific dimensions of the ship, and we also have, there's a nice section of the stern, a detailed section of the stern with the quarter galleries here, with the royal coat of arms as well. And you'll notice also at this stage that the gun ports are wreathed, which again was a style in the 17th century, which was then to disappear in the 18th century with the reduction of decoration. To identify this model further, we were very lucky that we've got some drawings that were made by the Dutch artist, the Van der Velde, which came and studied and painted in England in the 17th century. In fact, their studio was the Royal Palace in the museum, the Queen's House. And this is a lovely broadside drawing of the St Michael. And the figurehead, as well as the quarter gallery decoration, matches perfectly with the model itself. So there's no question that the model represents the St Michael. And we also know that the captain of the ship, Sir Robert Holmes, was in the possession of a ship model. It was written into his will when he died. So we can't prove, but we think that that model was once owned by Sir Robert Holmes, the captain. We also have another very important model of a privateer ship. That was a privately owned ship that was then bought by the Navy for use, for privateering, called the Mordaunt, which was a smaller fourth-rate 50-gun ship, 1685, still in the Navy Board style with these open frames, partly planked. And again, this model beautifully decorated with a lovely lion figurehead, similar to the one you have out here in the galleries. And the coat of arms appears on the break of the quarterdeck on the model. And again, there is this stunning Van der Velde drawing of the ship under full sail with very detailed stern decoration, which again matches with the model. The Mordaunt coat of arms is up here on the taffrail as well. So it's very rare for us in the UK to be able to identify ship models against actual ships. Most of the models themselves were proposed designs or discussion pieces, shall we say, or private commissions where they've been altered or changed over the years. As we move from the 17th century into the 18th century, you start to get scale ships plans appearing, at the same scale as the model, 1:48 scale. It was a manageable scale. You would end up with a plan about so big, and you could make the model from the plan as well as the full-size ship. And as you can see on here, you've got a full set of sections here, you've got the water lines, and you've got some decorative detail and the layout of the guns and the figurehead detail here. We also have a fine collection of royal yachts and yacht models. These were a huge status symbol in the 17th century in the UK. When our King, Charles II, came back from exile in Holland, he sailed a great deal on Dutch yachts and brought the sport back to the UK of yachting for pleasure and racing. And obviously, the thing to do was to have a yacht made so that you could sail or race against King Charles II. You had to let him win, of course, but that was different. But again, they're highly detailed in the navy board style with this lovely ornate carved decoration here. And this shows a yacht just to be launched with these launching flags. Most people think when a vessel is launched, it's launched with its mast stepped, which was not the case. The hull would be launched and then towed out into the river and moored alongside a floating crane or a sheer hulk, and that's where the mast would be stepped. It was too dangerous to launch a ship with the mast in position. That's a yacht of about 1680, 1690. As I said before, as we come into the 18th century, we start to design really quite technical warships in terms of naval architecture with all the different lines that are required to get the frames, shapes and the planking runs. And you start to get a lot of the internal detail as well with these ladderways for the powder rooms down here, ladders between the gun decks. You've also got cabin details up here in the quarter galleries and the poop deck. And it also shows where the masts are stepped here on the keelson and also some of the framing as well. By the early 18th century, to make a scale model of the models I've shown you just before would take too long and would cost too much money, and they weren't officially made by the Navy in the Navy dockyards. There was an order that was issued in 1715 that said every time a new plan or draft was submitted to the Navy for discussion, a block or solid would be made, which is what this model here represents. And these models were made in what we call bread and butter fashion, so a series of horizontal planks that were glued together and then shaped, and in some cases they were hollowed out to reduce the weight. And then they would paint on the details such as the gun ports. In some models there is decorative detail on the bow and also the stern. And these could be transported to London for discussion with a plan, either by water or by carriage, by horse and carriage along the roads. You can imagine the state of the carriage, the roads, a fine model like the Navy Board model would just shake apart and would be damaged, whereas these block models were very robust and a sort of three-dimensional working plan. Another way of getting your idea to the Navy Board, and these were predominantly from the private shipyards, which were dotted along the Thames, not just the Royal Dockyards. This is an ingenious way of selling your idea to the Navy by including a plan here in a folder. This is in a wooden folder with a series of cardboard cutouts of a six-rate 20-gun ship, and then by pulling a piece of string here, the whole thing comes up. It's like a flat pack from IKEA, and it just comes up like that. And there are probably about 2 or 3 of these in existence. A set of these was made for our royal family, and there's another set in private hands. And we're very fortunate that we know the name of the vessel, the date, the details about the ship itself as well. So that's quite another interesting type of model making. This is one of our earliest models of a smaller warship which has original sails. This is the only, these are our earliest surviving original sails, 1730. This is HMS Tartar, 1734. And again, you're starting to get now what we call the Georgian style. This is predominantly in the 18th century where the models themselves start to look more realistic towards the actual ships. They're fully planked, just partially unplanked to show the framing still, and some of the deck planking is framed. And largely they are rigged as well. To have a rigged model in the 17th century would cost a lot of money in terms of time, and also having space to display the model as well. So it was only the very wealthy that had these models in their possession. And in the 17th century, the sailing rig didn't really change much. There were no major technical developments apart from the jibboom here on the bowsprit and the shape of the fighting tops here and this sail here on the mizzenmast. Apart from that, the square rig pretty much sailed through most of the 18th century. And most of these models were built at the same time the ships were built, what we would call contemporary, which is has a different meaning to the American understanding of contemporary. By the mid-18th century, George III, our king, was on the throne and was very interested to know more about the Navy. And our head of the Navy at the time, Lord Sandwich, was very keen to get the king on his side so that the king could convince Parliament to put more money over to enlarging and rebuilding the Navy, which was in pretty poor condition at this time by the mid-18th century. And Sandwich commissioned a series of models, all the different sizes and rates of ship in the Navy, to give him an idea of what he was looking at, together with some paintings and some very detailed models of shipyards, the Royal Dockyards. And this is a truly stunning model of a three-deck warship. This is top of the range, first rate, called the Royal George, which sadly sank at Spithead in 1744. Rather like the Vasa, it was a bit of an accident, unfortunately. But we were able to have, this model was made before the sinking of the ship. And on the one side, on the port side, it's open frame, so you can see inside the model. And on the opposite side, it's fully planked. You'll notice also now that they're starting to use bone and ivory and tortoiseshell to sort of highlight features of the model. It was a way of attracting the eye to the viewer on the model itself. That's a lovely view of the stern. You can see here the fully planked starboard side and the open frame side of the port side. By this date, we were starting to put the names of ships on the stern counter here. That only lasted until the Napoleonic Wars, when we thought it probably wasn't a good idea because the enemy could see that, you know, it was an English warship that was giving them grief. But it's got these lovely open stern galleries here, 3 tiers, beautiful stern lanterns which are carved in bone, which actually have candles inside them as well. We've been able to go inside this model with an endoscope, which is something I've been using for many, many years, and the model is so detailed, it's like actually walking on the real ship. That's the figurehead. So that figurehead is probably about that sort of size, and it's carved from a single piece of boxwood. It really is quite stunning in terms of its craftsmanship. You can even see the inflated veins here in the stomach of the horse and the sort of flaring nostrils. Oh, there we are. Look, you can get even closer. Look at that. And you can see the use of bone and inlay here on the rails of the bowsprit, of the bow. And of course, it's King George riding on horseback. This is me using a rather ancient flexible endoscope. This is a medical endoscope. For any of you who've had the pleasure, it's another use of a machine rather than medical. And we've got a nice video unit here. This is the old light box, and then we can record what we find inside the models. And this is what we come across when we go inside a model. Incredible detail, where for some reason it was put into the model and then planked up. In some cases you can see this detail if you're really careful with the right sort of lighting, but in most cases it remains hidden, and it's a bit of a mystery as to why it was put in there. I mean, in this case, this model was made for George III, so of course the model maker had ulterior motives. He was obviously, you know, very proud of his work and wanted to make it, you know, make it look the best. So this is up here in the forecastle with the main capstan. This is in the forecastle again with the cooking galley. This is where all the food was cooked, and you know, you've got a kettle for boiling water up here. You've got a bread oven down here, and this is the roasting spit here. And this is actually made in iron as well, and it's probably about this sort of size inside the model. In some cases on the floor you get actual tiles, ceramic tiles, because obviously having fire on board was the worst thing you could have on a warship. You know, being wooden with explosive, it's not a good mixture. And this is in the cabins, in the stern. This is where the admiral and the captain would be. You've got these lovely panelled bulkheads with doors, with glazed doors. There's glass in these doors. They're hinged, they actually work. There's door handles on them as well. You've got these lovely bone-pierced rails around the stairways leading down below on the decks. The decks themselves are planked, and you've got these lovely panelled doors here in the side. And then this is the grand cabin of the admiral, with a beautifully laid marquetry floor with a compass rose, with a small fire to keep him warm, and again these lovely panelled doors. In some of the models we go into, they're actually painted as well in sort of duck egg blue and whites and reds. And because they're not affected by light, it's actually quite an accurate paint to get an idea of the original paint scheme as well. This shows a model in frame. This is how a ship would actually be built, and this was made for George III as well, to be taught all the different parts of a ship, you know, the wing transoms, all the different frames. You know, frames are made up from a series of different bits of wood, not from a single piece of wood. And then you've got these ribbons here, which hold the frames in place while you plank the hull up itself. And this is a large-scale model, like your models on display here, to show how a ship was actually constructed. And you'll notice there's very little gaps between the frames. It's virtually a solid wooden hull, as opposed to the early Navy board style, where it was a stylised framing. This is how a ship was actually built in the Royal. And then this was one of the 6 models that Sandwich commissioned of the Royal Dockyards to show the King. The idea was you would have small craft arriving here with the wood in the round, barked in its raw state, and then you could actually talk your way round through the dockyard, all the different processes that the wood would go through, and then eventually you would arrive on the slipway here where the ships were being constructed. So it gave you a full visual story of the construction of a warship. This is the Deptford Dockyard, which is very close to Greenwich in London, and you can see here a ship in construction on the slipway with the frames being assembled here, and another one being worked in a small dry dock here. And this is the great storehouse. This is where all the victualling was stored, like all the ship's stores and the equipment. And surprisingly, this building was still surviving until the 1970s, but then it was knocked down by the local council at the time in London. The clock tower survives, but the rest of the building is now gone, which is a great shame, because it was quite an impressive building for its time, quite groundbreaking, and obviously, you know, it dominated the skyline for many, many years. You can see here the barges arriving with the wood in its raw state from downriver. This is a very important model of a 2-decker, 74-gun ship. This became the standard sailing warship from the mid-18th century into the early 19th century. It was the backbone of the Royal Navy. It was a good size, it was powerful, it would sail fast and could carry a good complement of crew. And its primary role of the model was to show the copper sheathing of a ship. The reason for sheathing a hull in copper was to stop weed growth, which slowed a ship down when it was under sail, and it also prevented damage from the marine boring worm, Teredo nivalis. And by copper sheathing the hull in salt water, you get electrolytic reaction, which is a chemical reaction which produces a toxin, chemical toxin, which means that the weed cannot hang on to the hull to slow the ship down, and it obviously keeps the worm away as well. And I'll come back to this model at the end, because we've been inside this with an endoscope, which has revealed an interesting story behind it. And that shows you how a ship was launched. I was saying earlier that it was launched on a cradle. There are no masts stepped, and it would be floated out into the river and towed alongside a masting hulk or a sheer hulk for the mast to be stepped and rigged. This is quite an interesting small model of a cutter, a very shallow hull, because it was used for surveying coastlines and developed by a Dutch captain called Captain Schank. And this is where the idea of drop keels came about, because you've got a very shallow hull but a very large sail area, and of course you want to prevent leeway, which means blowing your ship sideways. You would raise and lower these drop keels by this mechanism here on the decks, these winches. So this is the earliest form, as we know, of sliding or drop keels in its sailing form. And this was a model that was commissioned by Captain Schank. And by the late 18th century, you're now getting ships, models, actually replicating how the ship would be itself. Fully planked, fully decked, apart from the openings here, in a dry dock. This is the Mermaid of 1782, a 32-gun frigate. Another interesting group of models we have in the collection, and these are quite well known around Europe, are what we call prisoner of war models. These models evolved during the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France from 1780 to 1815. And we had a large number of French prisoners that were stationed or held prisoner in the UK in land-based prisons, as well as floating hulks, prison hulks in the dockyards. And obviously they were given a weekly ration of meat on the bone as well as other food, and they would boil the bones down and eat the meat and have the broth, and then they were left with this raw material of bone. And they made many objects that they would sell market, the prisons were open once or twice a week to the local public to sell their wares, and these models became very popular. They're basically a wooden carcass to which the bone is then pinned. And one of the interesting features of these models, you'll notice here, there's a pull cord at the stern, and the guns are all mounted on a single wooden sprung-loaded mechanism, and you can push them in to their loading position. They stay locked, and then by pulling the cord, they pop out to the firing position. So it's quite a sort of unique selling point. The unfortunate thing about these models is obviously they didn't work from scale plans. It was all from memory and the tools and the materials they had to hand. So you tend to find that the mast is too high, that the rake of the bowsprit is too great. The hull shape is slightly misshapen, but apart from that, the actual deck layout and the rigging is incredibly accurate because they actually lived and worked that area of the ship. The other little treat they used to do was they'd name a ship like this, possibly the Victory, because obviously the Victory to the UK was a very famous ship, at the Battle of Trafalgar. But clearly the Victory was a 3-decker warship, whereas this is a 2-decker 74. So again, it was a selling point to actually sell the model to the public. And these model makers became so well known that members of the public would come into the prison and they would commission them to make models of ships that were associated with their family. And the French officers were billeted with families in the local area as well, rather than in the prisons. So there's a very interesting industry going on in late 18th century, early 19th century Britain with the French prisoners. And some of them made such a good living at it, they actually stayed here at the cessation of the war and carried on making models as well. And they made quite a bit of money. They made them also in wood. This is towards the end of the war, as they built up their stock of materials and tools. And they even copper sheathed the hull as well. And you've got this lovely carved decoration here in boxwood as well. And you tend to get a mixture of English and French features on these models. You sometimes get an English captain on a French warship. And most of them are named after famous French warships as well, Le Mars. They also made them in ivory, smaller versions in ivory. And this is a small sloop with a mirrored background to reflect light, to sort of light the model up. And they made them in these beautiful little display cases where they've got this dyed straw marquetry effect. And they got the straw from the bedding that was issued to them when they was in the houses where they were stationed. In the 18th and 19th century, obviously, the private yards that were building the merchant fleets, the cargo ships, they would follow the lead of the Navy and have models made themselves of merchant ships, not in such great detail or in such large numbers as the Navy, but even so they made models. And this was a yard that was on the Thames near Greenwich that produced the East Indiamen, which were basically armed cargo ships. The Dutch had East Indiamen, they would trade to the Indies, the West Indies, and the English had a large fleet of East Indiamen for both passenger carrying as well as cargo and trading with the Far East. And again, they would name their ship. They were privately funded as well, and obviously the most successful would have a model made of them as well. They would also produce the standard cargo ships of the time in frame. This is one of our earliest models, working models, thought to be one of the oldest in the world, and it's powered by clockwork, a mechanism here, and it's of a steam yacht, 1822. And the good thing about this is that we know who made this and when. It was a chap called Alan Hunt. He signed the underside of the deck, aged 81, which is pretty good going for 1822. And in the stern of the model is a section of his business card. He was a very well-known professional model maker, cleaner and restorer as well, who lived in Southwark in London. So this is one of the rare examples we have in the UK where models are actually identified by a maker. Up until that point, it's very, very rare indeed to have the known maker of a model. As we move into the 19th century now, a large number of models are made of improvements to ship construction and design, as well as private individuals were submitting models for patent inventions, which were then lodged at the South Kensington Museum, where you would submit a scale drawing, a written specification and a scale model. And that's how we've got all these lovely smaller models of all the different ideas that people were coming up with on how to support a bow for launching. This is an idea that was proposed by a chap called Cunningham, where it was called roller reefing. Rather than furling a sail by hand, you would have a series of rigging and blocks, and it would literally roll up on this yard here. It's like a Venetian blind. And of course that reduced manpower, which came, you know, for the ship owners, was saving money at the end of the day. That's what it was about. We have a large collection of ordnance models of all the different types of ordnance that we use, the long guns, the mortars for bombarding shore establishments, and then you've got these carronades, which were a short but very effective, short range, very destructive gun. Beautiful models of a patent Blake's cooking galley that was actually on board a ship. You've got the cooking facilities up here for boiling liquids. You've got ovens for baking bread. This is obviously the officer's side, and then the other side, which is a bit plainer, is for the crew. And you've got taps here for tapping off hot water and stuff. 19th century. And these were actually used and put on board the ships themselves. You've got hot plates here as well, and that will be the funnel arrangement going up through the decks to take the heat away. We've got a series of models to improve life saving. There was a huge disaster in the late 18th century off of Newcastle where a ship was lost within almost touching distance of the shore, and the local people were so frustrated about not being able to help these people, they decided to set up a life-saving organisation, which is the forerunner of our Royal National Lifeboat Institution. And we have strong partners with life-saving institutions in Europe, in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And this was an early form of life-saving car, where you would actually launch the boat into the surf and you would hand paddle this out to the ship in distress. I'm not sure I would jump on board with this thing, but it must have been a lot of work. But again, we don't know whether it was ever used, but it was one of many ideas that were being submitted to save life at sea. This is another version where this was mounted on the deck of a ship. So if the ship started to sink, the cask, which is a large cask, would float away with all these grab rails, and you could get inside the barrel here. You could hoist a flag to show that you were in distress, and hopefully a passing ship would rescue you. This was this is a refuge beacon, and it is unplanked, and this was stationed on an area off of the southeast coast of the UK called the Goodwin Sands, which was a big shifting area of sands, which was always heavily littered with wrecks for many, many years. And this would float at high tide, and then at low tide it would sink and then fall on its side, so that if a ship went aground or was lost, you could actually get on board this, climb into this cabin, light the lamp here to show that you were in distress and needed rescue. You could signal with this semaphore here, and inside here was an actual boat that you could actually launch and hopefully row to the shore. I mean, this was only 20 miles offshore, the Goodwin Sands. This is a bit more interesting. By the 1830s, we were using rockets or pyrotechnics to get a line out to shore, from the shore to the ship. And these were on the ends of a rocket here. They would tangle in the rigging, and then you would pull a line out, and then you would pull out this life-saving buoy on a pulley, and then the distressed person would jump on from the ship into here and then be pulled ashore by the people on the shore, complete with his top hat as well. And then the standard lifeboats now, these are typical double-ended small crafts with these end boxes here and here. So if the boat was swamped or overturned, it would still float. These were sealed compartments, double-ended. And then this is the more traditional lifeboat that was developed in the 19th century for the RLNI and also around Europe as well, and America, you know, the double-ended self-righting lifeboat. Launched into the surf by the bow with a team of horses, and either launched afloat or kept in a boathouse. We have a lovely series of small boats that were taken on board a much larger warship. This shows you the size of some of these warships, where they carried a whole range of boats for different duties. The larger launches here for bringing in stores onto the ship when it was at anchor, and the smaller dinghies and gigs for transporting the naval officers to and from the ship when it was afloat. Royal barges to go with our naval collection, and yachts. This is of a royal barge of about 1900. We also have a large collection of models of leisure craft. The Henley Rowing Regatta, which is one of the oldest competitive rowing regattas in the world. You would often see these lovely Thames skiffs rowing up and down the river with ladies being rowed in their Victorian outfits and hats during the regatta season. typical wherry hull shape as well. You've got this very steep bow here, which enabled you to touch the ground here, and you could step off onto dry land without getting your feet wet. We also have racing boats. These are the famous racing fours and pairs that were used at Henley Regatta. We have a large collection of what we call foreign craft, ethnographic craft from around the world, some of which were brought back during the 19th century by naval officers. Others were made in the 19th century from sketches and measurements that were taken by naval officers, because they were constantly looking at different ways and different designs of how to improve a rig or the hull shape or the materials that were being used by different people around the world. We have a number of training models, rather like your models out here in the galleries, of large-scale models that show how to work a rig with the naval cadets. And this is a small sailing dinghy that we used in the 20th century of a naval sailing dinghy with all the different parts numbered up, lettered up to show how it worked and how it would sail. We have a large collection of half-block models, which was again in the 19th century was a quicker and easier way of producing the shape of a hull without having to go into too much detail. Again, these were built in bread and butter fashion, horizontally glued together and then shaped, and these would then be hung on a wall. These were more like a three-dimensional ship's plan, a traditional ship's plan. And later on in the 19th and 20th century, they were actually marking on the individual plates and the frames of a ship when it was built in steel or iron. And you have some plating models here in the collection. This is of a half model removed from its back plate, just to show the construction of the different layers of timber. And also you can just see here the pencil marks of the different stations of how they would transfer the shape across to the model itself. In the more smaller coastal yards, they will use a much more simplified version of a series of wooden bulkheads with these planks that would just be put on, and they can make this in a number of days. And a lot of these were destroyed because they were just made for one purpose only. And then you've got these lovely finished half models that were made for the owners of expensive yachts that they would display in their boardroom or in their house, or actually on board the yacht as well. And this one shows the different waterlines in different different finishes of wood. And as I said earlier, the plating models, this is now mid-20th century. These are a three-dimensional plan where you had to, what we call joggle or shuffle the actual plates in relation to the frame so that you could actually get the weld or the rivet lines in line so it didn't conflict with other parts of the ship. And it's literally a three-dimensional drawing. It's a wooden model which is then covered in a thin layer of gesso so that you could mark in ink the various features on it. Most of the dimensions are written on the rudder here, the ship's name and the major dimensions. In the 19th century you start to get what we call the builder's model, built at a 1:48 scale, full hull. This is our early paddle steamer, Rhadamanthus, 1830s, 40s. And then they start to really get detailed because you're getting merchant ships as well as warships. This is the Royal Yacht Victoria and Albert, 1845. Very detailed, very large scale, and this was exhibited at the Great Exhibition of 1851. By this time, they start to settle down to a specific style in terms of scale. A lot of the features are shown on deck. And then you get these really large early 20th century models. Some of these are 10, 12 foot long and weigh upwards of a ton, together with their lovely, beautiful display cases, which a lot of these models were made in the shipyards where the ships themselves were made as well, because they actually had the workforce that could produce this sort of craft work, because they would fit out the interiors of these ships as well. That's the Normandy, a French transatlantic liner that held the record for the Blue Ribbon across the North Atlantic. That model's about 12 foot long and is extremely heavy and was given to us by the French government. And you'd see a lot of these models in the shipping offices in London, New York, Paris, where you would go and purchase your ticket to go from New York to London. So they were used primarily for advertising, as well as these big international trade fairs that were held in Paris, London, New York, where the shipbuilders and ship owners would have stands with these models on to attract would-be buyers to either place an order with their yard or actually place a voyage with one of their ships, with their company. This is a large-scale model of a Brazilian battleship that we built and designed for the Brazilian Navy, the Minas Gerais of 1905. Ooh, what's happened there? Shouldn't have that. There we go. There's a bit of a gap going on there, isn't it? there should be a detail on that model. Oh, anyway, you can see on here that a lot of the fittings are gold or silver plated. Again, this was a style that was used to attract these people onto the actual stand themselves. It's just, and by the 20th century, leading up to the Second World War and after the Second World War, the size of the ships were increasing, but obviously money was tight, so they actually scaled the model down to a much smaller scale, 1:96 scale. Still using the traditional gold and silver plated fittings, but the models are much more manageable, and you have a number of these outside in the... Right, we seem to have a problem here. We're missing some images. There we are. Right, sorry about that. As I was saying earlier, this is our Minas Gerais model, the Dreadnought, our early warship. And you can see here, you've got these lovely silver-plated gun barrels here and deck fittings in gold as well. And this was a typical builder's model style of promoting the ship and the model itself. Incredible amount of detail as well. All the rails, stanchions, all the hatch covers as well, complete with their bolts and the launches in the waist here as well. Heavily armed. And this is a large-scale model, 1:48 scale. As I said, by the beginning of the Second World War and post-Second World War, the ships themselves were being built in much larger numbers as well as size, and obviously the money was tight, so the models themselves were scaled down to a scale of 1:96, a metric scale. And then it's the case now for modern models. This is obviously a container ship that we have in the collection from the 1980s, and it's the case now where there aren't so many models made for shipbuilders or ship owners. They generally commission to look for a launching ceremony. This is probably one of our most modern models in the collection. It's of a liquefied gas carrier used for bringing the gas in its liquid form, and to transport gas you have to keep it at a very low temperature here, and these cells here are insulated, and this model has been cut away to show the different layers of insulation. You can just see them here in the corner, and it shows you the carrying capacity of these ships. Other models are made for different reasons. Models were made for inquiries or commissions if there was a disaster, and this was a model of a British submarine called the Thetis that went down off of Birkenhead in the war. And this was made for a courtroom to explain the various construction and the means of escape for the crew to get out of the submarine, because the whole crew was lost. It was on trials at the time when the submarine was lost. It was one of the Navy's worst disasters in the 20th century. And all the air tanks here, the ballast tanks, they all come off as well. So it's a nice working tactile model. We commission, as a museum, like you, models for specific exhibitions. And this was a model that was commissioned to show the ultimate development of the sailing ship, in terms of it's a steel riveted hull with steel masts and yards and wire rigging as well. So this was really it. This was the largest you could really make that would carry cargo in bulk economically without sort of to compete against the steamers. And we also have model making competitions over the years, which are, again, international. We've had models made from South Africa, from Europe, and this was won by a gentleman from America, a chap called Cleveland, of a Thames sailing barge loading bricks in the sort of early 20th century. And this model lights up as well as a bulb that shows up the hold and cargo area of the actual ship itself. And then again, the Grand Princess model, as I showed you at the beginning, built specifically for our Living at Sea exhibition and passengers. And then these ships are just literally boxes of cabins. I mean, there's not a great deal of detail on them now. They are very functional, and they just go from A to B in the Caribbean, really. We've also acquired models from other museums. This is one of a set of models that was transferred from the Imperial War Museum, which is one of our sister museums in London, which unfortunately was bombed during the war and suffered a great deal of damage from bombs and incendiaries. And a number of models were rescued and then just put into deep storage and forgotten about and discovered many years later. And we acquired this model of a hospital ship, shallow draft, for working in the African rivers. And you can see here it's in a terrible state, but over the years we've been conserving it by taking off the decks. There's a lot of metal corrosion going on down there. We think there's chemical corrosion from the incendiaries and also the water that was used to put the fires out. And little by little, you gradually strip the model down to reveal all the detail. You can see here a lot of the metal fittings have corroded. And we also use a memory board to take the fixtures and fittings off the model and place them onto the memory board so that we don't put them back in the wrong place. And we use photography as well. And we also scan them with a laser. And then we start to rebuild the model, stage by stage. There's the damage to the paddle box. You know, it's been smashed with corrosion going on. We then infill the damaged areas, and there's the finished paddle box there on the model. So it's a lot of painstaking work that goes on to bring these models back to their former glory. There's damage to the bow here as well. We're very lucky in that we have 3 full-time staff that look after the organics collection, which includes the models. I'll just quickly go through, about 6-7 years ago we were looking at moving our model collection to a new store, and our colleagues down in the Chatham Historic Dockyard, the Smithery building, which is this building here, was the last building on the site to remain derelict, and they wanted to get the building restored, and we wanted to find a home for our new model store. So we put a joint bid into the HLF, a Heritage Lottery Fund, a government funded lottery, and they were able to give us some of the funding for a new store to be built. It cost 13.5 million, and we transported the models in large lorries. This is what the building looked like before it was conserved. The floor was damaged with and it was impregnated with toxic waste, and had to be cleaned. It had to have a new roof put on it as well. You can see the state of the walls. And then we had to then prepare the collection, so we had to get them all boxed and put onto mounts. Fortunately, we photographed the models before they went, and now the collection is available online. You can look at the photographs online with their database. And that's how we would transport these small Dazzle models in these foam baseboards. The larger rig models were transported in these trolleys on wheels with shelves that pulled out. Because some models had cases, some didn't. And we had a very complex computer program to actually work out where the models would end up in the new store. Unfortunately, because of the size and configuration of the models, a lot of the Navy Ball models are spaced all over the store, but hopefully in time I'll get them all grouped together so they make a really good research collection without having to go all over the store to look at 3 models. You can see the problems that we have about moving and storing models. A lot of the models are in their own cases and then on purpose built pallets that will stay with the model. And we use this large stacker here to actually place them high up so that we're using the full space of the store itself, whereas the older store didn't. We were wasting a lot of this space. And in some cases, models were just mounted on pallets themselves. This is a very heavily controlled area. There's no light ingress. It's temperature controlled, humidity controlled, and there's a gas fire system in there as well. And it's basically an adapted racking system that's used for manuscripts and books. It's geared down so there's very little vibration, and you can literally move these racks, which weigh several tons, with one hand. It's a very impressive setup. The shelvings themselves are completely flexible, both in terms of their height and length. And you can see here, they're completely gas-free. They don't off-gas or anything like that, so it's a completely sterile environment. And every model will have a location as well. And these are some of the larger ones. Some of the larger rigged, more delicate models, we actually had to make a wooden case with a polythene cover over them with a pallet base on them as well. And this, if you come to the UK and to Greenwich, I would recommend that you come and visit the store. And this is our collections research area, so if a member of the public wants to come and look at a model, photograph it or measure it, we will get the model out if it's not too big and put it in this area for them to study with controlled access. And we do encourage this as well. And this is where we do a lot of our endoscopy work. And we give guided tours as well around our store as well. So if a group of you come, be more than happy to sort of host you and show you around the store. But there's a lot of models to see, unfortunately. So you know, you won't see everything, but it means you can come back. Together with the store, we also had some new galleries commissioned as well. This is the entrance to the gallery. The dockyard itself had a temporary exhibition gallery where they could take in touring exhibitions. And on the other side, we had a permanent gallery for where we could display our models. And these are our new big glass cases with the models being hung at different levels. That gives you an idea of, you know, in terms of scale and to see the models in different angles. Fibre optical lighting, so it's cold lighting, so the models are not affected in any way, with all the humidity and temperature controls in the bottom of the cases. So these are microclimate cases, even though they're huge cases. It's built to a very high specification and very expensive. And then we also explain about the dockyard model that was commissioned by Sandwich of the actual dockyard where the store is situated. And this is the temporary exhibition gallery where we have touring exhibitions. And that can be anything. It can be not just maritime focused, it can be you know, Chatham based as well. And that's the building itself in the dockyard. This is the old smithery, which is where they used to work metal into frames and to plates. So that's the ship model collection. I'll just quickly show you, if I may. I just killed it, and that's it, right? I mentioned earlier that we were, let's just zoom this up a minute. Remember I spoke to you about the Bologna model. Let's just skip that on there a minute. Oop, giving the game away now. We were going inside that lovely coppered model with an endoscope just to see what was inside it, because it's very detailed in the cabin. And we went down into the hold below the gun decks just to see how the model was made, and it was made in a traditional way. And what has always puzzled us is that the ship itself was launched in 1759-1760, but the model shows it at a later stage with the copper sheathing and the name on the stern. And we've always wondered whether the model was made at that date or whether it was made earlier and then upgraded for the King. Well, as we were looking with the endoscope, we found this note on the... Now, we're going inside the hold here, but we're upside down at the moment, so I came back out. Because with the camera, you have to reorientate yourself. Right, we're now turning the camera around. And then we're going through the main hatch, which goes right the way through down into the keel. And you can imagine, these flexible endoscopes have got a mind of their own. They're very rigid, and you have to sort of, you're sort of struggling. It's like struggling with a boa constrictor. Goodness gracious, this is a bit heavy on the eyes, isn't it? Let's see if we can, I think we're right. And here we go. Right, now we're going in down through the main hatch here. Okay, so there's the stairway going down. That's the side of the ship with a gun port. Now we're looking into the hold of the model, and you can see all these shavings and bits and pieces that have fallen into the model itself. That's the main gun deck. Okay. Now it's taken me 20 years to find a note inside a model of endoscoping models, and as I was poking around, this appeared, which was extremely exciting and quite rare for us. And we were able to actually read this, William Thompson, and on the other side, Thomas Burkitt, facet, made at Chatham, 1759. And that answered the question. We were able to say that the model itself was actually made when the ship was launched by these two gentlemen in Chatham, which is where the model is now, funny enough, and then was later used by Lord Sandwich and upgraded to show the copper sheathing of the ship itself. And this is the only model we have in the collection that's got a note inside it, a contemporary note. Other examples I've found have been where the notes have been rolled and then dropped into the model once the model's been finished, or we've found notes actually pinned to the side of the hull. They've been folded paper and actually pinned to the side of the hull. There are about 4 in existence at the moment, but there you are. That's our famous note. Well, I was saying to you, some of you earlier, when you're inside these models, you get all these cobwebs and stuff hanging. It's like diving on the wreck of the Titanic. It's quite eerie. You're sort of, and you can see along, and you sometimes get, you know, dead insects in there as well. So it's really like a time capsule, and we've got no intention of taking that note out because we can read it. There's no point in bringing it out, and all the stuff that's inside we're going to leave until later on when we can actually explore them scientifically and actually hopefully find out, you know, more from the debris that's inside the model in terms of what's in there, why it's in there, and whether it tells us anything about life in the 18th century. Who knows, you know. A lot of these models, when they were transported by road, were actually put into boxes with straw, and we find a lot of the models have got straw and fibres inside in the models as well. So I've been talking with my colleagues at the Natural History Museum in London, and they're really quite keen to get some samples of this material just to see whether it's from the 18th century and whether it tells them anything about the climate or the environment at the time. So that's the ship model collection at Greenwich. I urge you to come to London and visit. I would gladly show you the stores and the models themselves. And I'm happy to sort of take questions if you'd like to ask some questions.